Okay, so like there was a transaction phase, and we would have multiple versions of Hyperledger available. So we have, as we have multiple versions of the Hyperledger available, and we have been trying to do this particular project for more than 1.5 years now. So I'll show the different versions with which we try to achieve certain things and how we are continuously enhancing the experience that is there as part of this particular project. So we started with 0.6, where we started to develop a prototype, but a few transactions could be done, and 0.6 was not stable at all. So it was like you could not move forward. Then 1.0 solved those stability problems. But then when we put it in a kind of a pilot phase for this particular project, and when the transaction load came, it started to get slow. The problem to be solved is real-time reconciliations, right? And if it's not achieving it, the goal is not achieved. So we had to immediately move on the 1.1 release when it came. So now it was much more stable. It was able to handle a much larger TPS. But still, there are certain areas for which the problem remained. So when you are doing this particular transaction or stamping the transactions on the blockchain, it requires a lot of storage as well. Because here we are talking about multiple government entities, so each of them have multiple nodes as well. So for each of the nodes, you have this storage that is required. Now, other than that, the orderers, they would also have their storage because of their logs. The Kafka clusters, they would also have their storage. So the storage size increases quite much, right? And another issue is related to the privacy. How many channels do you create? Because here, you have 3 parties available at any particular time, and try to understand this, that one of the department, which is roads authority, and another department, which is police. They would not both want that my transaction should be visible to the other. At the other end, there are banks involved because they are the one who actually collects the fund. So they will also say my transaction would not be available to anybody else. So now, we cannot create many channels, like one entity, then this Department of Finance, and then that particular bank, then another entity, then Department of Finance and any other bank, right? So we have to come around to some kind of solution. So what we end up doing is that we created one channel between this Department of Finance and this government entity to put all the transaction there, and another channel between the bank and the Department of Finance. And then we wrote code on top of it, so it was taking it from one channel and putting the transaction when required on the other channel. But this is not a kind of a graceful approach. And then 1.2 and 1.3 release came on, where we have privacy collection. So gradually, these were the different problems encountered, and this is how we are continuously going and evolving the systems so that it could support the kind of scalability that is required. Because as much as like 50 to 60,000 transactions comes per day which are stamped on this particular system. Other than the technical challenges, there were other challenges in terms of doing the implementation. Now, while we started to do, and since there are many entities involved whereby there are multiple nodes available, so setting up the whole infrastructure for Hyperledger, because it is essentially decentralized, would not allow you to test the business level functionality. Right? So we started with this particular thing in mind that, okay, we will install and there would be decentralization, and then test on top of it our smart contracts and all the different areas of the application. But we ended up putting all the nodes together in one environment, asking the business to actually mature, test all the processes across, because there are many other processes, because what happens if there is a refund of this particular transaction, how the impacts would be there. What happens for verifying the actual amounts for the settlements, all these things are critical, right? So they started to have just one area whereby all the nodes were available. They tested the business functionality at the same time. At the background, the infrastructure was set up, and then we moved the nodes across to the actual participants. Now, Along with that, there are other challenges that come because there are many organizations involved. So each of them have their own infrastructure policies. Each of them have their own security policies. And since this discipline is being matured, right, there are not many best practices. Like, for example, if we see that, how do we backtrack that, okay, this was a particular transaction, but on the blockchain, how they are going to find out that, okay, this is the proof. With blockchain, people ignore that, okay, it's blockchain, all the transactions are there. But in case of a dispute, how do you do the auditability? That should be easier, right? Because those security guys will want to evaluate that as part of a delivery of the project. So how do you do that? So we learned those particular areas. Smart contract deployment process. Now, if there are many parties involved, and if you go to the command line and deploy the smart contract, whoever is doing that, he is in charge of making all the terms and conditions in favor. So how do you do it in a graceful manner? So there needs to be a workflow or a smart contract for the deployment process as well, where everybody votes, okay, this is a correct contract, and this should be the one that should go. Otherwise, it should not be deployed at all. So those kind of things we had to build it as part of, because it was not provided readily by the Hyperledger. Otherwise, the solution would have this not get the security clearance, because anyway, it's a government system. Then there would be cases whereby how you evaluate that, okay, if a rogue nodes come on, what would be the impacts, right? So all these things, the Hyperledger is continuously in the evolution phase, so there are many things which are coming up, but then when those things were not available, we had to do something about it. So these were some of the challenges we had in terms of security. One other area was that customers generally have not embraced this containerization technologies yet, like Kubernetes or Docker swarms as well. So while deployment of these particular infrastructures, those kind of questions also come in, that are the Docker containers secured? Are they pretty much hardened? What are the things? What is the base operating system? Like most of the organization, they are not quite much comfortable with Ubuntu. They say, okay, it should be based on a Red Hat container. So these are a lot of challenges in terms of, which are not related to the blockchain, but some other challenges which are there as part of the ecosystem. So I'll invite